The signs of collapse are everywhere. We've got economic collapse, societal collapse, we even had a recent bridge collapse. So it's only a matter of time before the total collapse of the entire industrial manufacturing base. And who will save the world from this situation? Well, you will, of course. And all it takes is a few $100s worth of cheap components that you bought off of eBay. Okay, so before you rush out and spend a bunch of money on cheap eBay components to build your industrial manufacturing base, I think it's worth mentioning that the best way to go about this is iteratively and in baby steps. Otherwise, you're just going to waste a bunch of money on expensive junk that you don't need and will probably never use. So the first thing that you've probably done by now is buy a stepper motor. And if you watched my other video, you already know that you can't do anything with it unless you also have a motor driver. So let's say that you bought the motor driver too, and you've got your motor driver hooked up to an Arduino or some kind of controller, and you're able to actually control the motor and run it. It's at this point that you realize you can't really manufacture much with this setup. So right now, all you've got is a loose motor flopping around, and you think you're the next Elon Musk? What are you going to manufacture with that? So at this point, you might not know what to do next. For starters, you can get a NEMA 17 bracket. And that goes on the motor like this to keep it steady. You can also buy flat brackets like this one. NEMA 17 is a standard that defines the position of these screw holes. So this way, NEMA faceplate motors and the brackets that connect to them are basically a commodity item. And if it's a commodity item, it'll be cheaper. So here's an eBay listing of one that I bought. Most of these things I bought a couple years ago, so all the prices I show have probably gone up since then. So as you can see, I paid $5 for this and $1.30 shipping. And a lot of times too, if you buy 5 or 10 at a time, you'll get a much better deal. So now that your motor is connected to a bracket and you can keep it stable, you're a bit closer to doing something useful. But now you're wondering, how do you actually get the motor to move and manipulate things? So the next thing you do is buy some of these GT2 timing pulleys. And if you shop around for these, you can get some really great deals. So there's 5 pieces there, and I paid $4.50 Canadian. And the shipping was 50 cents. So that's basically $1.01 per pulley. So then what you do is wait approximately 2 months for this extremely cheap pulley to arrive from China. And then as soon as it arrives, you try and put it on the shaft. And that's when you realize it doesn't fit. And then you go back and check what you ordered, and you realize that you ordered a pulley with a bore hole of 4 millimeters. But the shaft diameter of the motor is 5 millimeters. So then, another 2 months later, after you order a pulley with the right bore size, you can finally put it onto the motor. And the way you attach it to the shaft is with these little set screws. Okay, so now you've got a pulley on there, and you can rotate the pulley, but it still doesn't do anything useful. So the next thing you can do is buy one of these. So this thing here is a GT2 ring closed loop timing belt. The 6 millimeter is the belt width, and for this I paid $1.76, and the shipping was free. Okay, now you've got your pulleys and belts and stuff. So you can kind of imagine doing something useful, but you need some way to attach the other gear to something. And that's when you could buy something like this. These here are just simple steel rods that are 5 millimeters in diameter, 100 millimeters in length, and you can get 5 pieces for $5 with $4 shipping. And this listing here is, I think, a very good example of how you have to be very resourceful and do a lot of research to get the absolute cheapest possible component that does what you want. So in this listing, they call it a model car transmission gear connection shaft. And in this listing here, which is basically the same thing, but only it's 80 millimeters long instead of 100, they call it a solid fixed dowel pin, cylindrical pin. And I've also seen listings where they'll call it like carbon steel rods, 304 stainless steel rods. So it's almost like learning how to speak a new language. You have to figure out what terms the vendors are using and then search for that. So now you wait another 2 months and you've got your carbon steel rods and your gears, and you've also taken the time to make sure that the borehole is the right size. And by the way, you can buy these in a number of different sizes, and in my experience, I found that if you go with a borehole size of 5 millimeters, that gives you the most options available for motors, for shafts, and whatever kind of components you want to connect to things. Now sometimes you might have a situation where you have 2 different shafts of different size, and you want to connect them together. So you can also buy shaft couplers. So on this end, I think that's 5 millimeter, and then the other one is probably 4. And these things come with little set screws that you can use to tighten them to the shaft. And I think that this listing is the one I was just holding. So I paid $1.96 for that, and the shipping was free. And you can also buy more fancy shaft couplers like this one. One like this is quite a bit more expensive. And if you want to, you can actually buy set screws by themselves. Set screws by themselves cost next to nothing. And they're useful because if you want to create some kind of shaft coupler on your own, you can just buy a simple ring like this. I think I bought this from a listing that called it a bushing. In my case, I was not able to find a shaft coupler in this size that was cheap on eBay, so I decided to just buy the brass ring, and I plan to drill a hole in it and then just use my own set screws. So my eventual goal will be to add a set screw into this ring and use the set screw to attach it rigidly to the inner ring, and then I'll put another set screw in here, so that way I can tighten it to this shaft coupler that I was able to find. Then I can attach the whole thing to a shaft, And the eventual goal is to attach the whole thing to the knob on my rotation stage, and that'll make it a lot more stable than the other lopsided gear that I had. It'll also give me more free space on the rotation stage. Now, when it comes to drilling stuff, you might think that's very expensive and it's not something that's accessible to you. But I was actually surprised to learn that I can pick up a fairly good drill press at Canadian Tire on sale for $150. So I went ahead and did that, and now I'm starting to drill stuff. And if you don't know anything about drilling, it's important to distinguish between drill bits and taps. So drill bits will give you a smooth hole, and taps are what you can use to thread the hole, so that way you can put a screw in there. And if you search around, you can probably find a cheap tap set. This here is actually a tap and die set. So these here are called dies, and these things up here are called taps. And you can use one of these bars to hold onto the tap. So if you want to start prepping for the total collapse, you should probably start now. Things like these gears are available right now for a couple bucks, but they'll be basically impossible to buy once the supply chain collapses, or they'll have lead times of like 2 years, and they'll be like 20 times as expensive. The other thing that you should ask is, what kinds of components already exist and are mass-produced and cheap, but also flexible enough to be repurposed for other stuff? I think a good example of that is the toy car shaft, or the dowel pins. If you want to delve into this stuff, you should probably just start by buying 1 or 2 components and wait the 2-month shipping period for it to arrive. And then only after you've taken the time to play around with it, you'll know what you need to buy next. It's quite often that I buy something, and it's not until I get it in my hands that I realize that I need a different connector or a slightly different size. So buying too much at once is a good way to waste a lot of money. Generally speaking, you might think that doing mechanical stuff is insanely expensive, and it definitely can be if you need the highest quality parts and you have to overnight ship everything. But if you're doing it as a hobby and you're willing to wait insanely long amounts of time for slow shipping from China, you can build surprisingly interesting things for very little money. The most important secret is to figure out which parts seem to be the most well standardized and have high volume. These are the ones that you can get incredibly good deals on. You also have to do a lot of research to figure out exactly what search keywords to use, and how to decipher the sometimes cryptic listings that you find on eBay. Most of these listings are targeted towards people who already know what the part is and what it does, so you really have to get into the mind of a distributor. Sometimes the listings are confusing enough that I have to actually buy a part just so I can look at it and figure out what the details in the listing mean. Okay, that's all I have time for today.